Welcome to Miss Marple Mystery. In the snow-blanketed village of Mildred's, a single candle keeps burning long after Christmas Eve, its light hiding a sin darker than night itself. What secret smolders beneath that flame? Where are you listening from? Let us know in the comments. The village of Mildred's lay beneath a quiet quilt of snow that Christmas Eve, the sort of picture postcard scene Miss Marple often described as dangerous in its calm. Icicles hung like crystal daggers from cottage roofs, smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and the distant peal of church bells drifted over the frosty air. But despite the charm, there lingered a sense of unease, something that didn't quite belong to the season of peace. At precisely 5:30, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Dolly Larch, bustled out of Mildred's church with a large key ring and a worried look. The Christmas Eve service had ended hours ago, yet one of the candles, an enormous beeswax pillar on the altar, was still burning. "Strange," she murmured to herself, her breath puffing like steam. "I'm quite sure I snuffed them all out." She hesitated, her gloved hand trembling as she reached for the brass extinguisher. The candle's flame flickered tall and defiant, throwing a strange golden light against the carved wooden panels behind it. Miss Marple, who had stayed behind to arrange the poinsettias, looked up from her work. "Perhaps someone came in afterward, my dear," she suggested mildly. Her blue eyes, sharp as frost, lingered on the pool of wax gathered at the candle's base. "It must have been burning for some time." Mrs. Larch sighed. "Oh, I do hope the choir boys haven't been playing tricks again. Reverend Larch would have an apoplexy if he thought we'd left a candle burning overnight." But as Miss Marple's gaze drifted across the altar rail, something caught her attention, a small dark stain on the white linen cloth just beneath the candelabrum. She moved, closer. "My dear Dolly," she said quietly, "I don't believe this is candle wax." Mrs. Larch bent forward, blinking. "Good heavens, it looks like, well, blood," Miss Marple finished gently. The two women stood in silence, the only sound the faint hiss of the candle flame. It seemed impossible. Blood on the altar, in their dear little church. Mrs. Larch, flustered beyond measure, rushed to fetch her husband, who was in the vestry writing his sermon notes. Reverend Larch, a tall, mild man with a habit of smoothing his hair when nervous, hurried in, his eyes widening as he saw the stain. "This is most irregular," he stammered. Completely out of order. We must inform Inspector Cray immediately." Within the hour, word had spread through the village faster than wildfire on dry straw. Blood found in the church on Christmas Eve. And by the time Inspector Cray arrived, a stout man with a red face and a fondness for declaring things cut and dry, half the village had already assembled outside the church gate. Inside, Cray examined the altar with his notebook open and his brow furrowed. "No body, no weapon," he muttered. "Could be nothing more than an accident." Miss Marple, standing quietly near the font, spoke up. "And yet," she said softly, "there's something very peculiar about the candle." Cray turned. "Peculiar, Miss Marple?" "Yes. You see, it's been burning rather longer than one would expect. Look how the wax has run down in thick layers. It must have been lit again sometime after the evening service, perhaps even during the night." The inspector sniffed. "Someone might have come to pray. Or light it for the Christmas vigil." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Possibly. But one does wonder who would come to pray at such an hour, and why they would bring blood with them." By Christmas morning, the mystery deepened. The snow had thickened overnight, and with it came grim news from the edge of the village. A farmhand from Bramble Cottage, trudging through the drifts on his way to feed the hens, had found something dreadful behind the old lysh gate near the churchyard. A man's hat, half buried in snow, and beside it, a leather glove soaked in blood. The glove was soon identified as belonging to Colonel Leonard Morley, retired army officer and one of Mildred's more respected residents. He lived alone in Rosebank House at the top of the hill, kept his garden immaculate, and had quarreled with nearly everyone at one time or another, particularly over property boundaries. When Inspector Cray and his men knocked at Rosebank House, no one answered. The front door was locked, but a faint wisp of smoke rose from the chimney. Cray broke a window pane and entered. The drawing room was tidy, the fire low, and the Colonel's coat still hanging in the hall. Upstairs, the bed was unslept in. But in the study, there they found something that made even the inspector pause. On the writing desk lay a half-written letter, addressed to "My solicitor, Mr. Frobisher," and beneath it a smear of blood on the paper. The pen had fallen to the floor, its nib broken. "Looks like he cut himself, then went out," one constable suggested. "Cut himself?" Cray barked. "On what? There's no razor, no glass, no knife." Miss Marple, who had arrived at the house shortly after hearing the news, ostensibly to bring hot tea to Mrs. Larch, stood quietly in the doorway. "I dare say," she murmured, "that he went out to meet someone, and perhaps that someone didn't wish to be seen." Cray frowned. "You think foul play, Miss Marple?" She gave a small, regretful smile. "My dear Inspector, I think human nature rarely takes holidays even at Christmas." Outside, the snow continued to fall in a soft, muffled hush, covering footprints almost as soon as they appeared. But Miss Marple, as she looked toward the distant church steeple, felt sure that one set of prints somewhere beneath that endless white would tell her everything she needed to know. The candle on the altar still burned when the church door was locked that night. By the time the Christmas morning bells rang across Mildred's, the entire village was humming with speculation. At the Blue Finch tea shop, the center of all things whispered and exaggerated. The talk was not of plum pudding or hymns, but of Colonel Morley and the blood on the altar. Mrs. Weatherby, who claimed her cousin's niece had once worked for the Morleys as a maid, leaned forward over her scone and lowered her voice to a tremulous whisper. "They say it's a ritual of sorts, something foreign. You know the Colonel spent years in India. There are strange customs there, I've heard." Mrs. Price, the butcher's wife, sniffed. "Rubbish. It's more likely that temper of his. Didn't he have a row with young Mr. Clemens over that parcel of land near the river? I wouldn't be surprised if he finally took a swing and got one back." Miss Marple, seated quietly at the corner table with her knitting, appeared not to be listening. Her needles clicked rhythmically, though her mind was weaving its own pattern entirely separate from the wool in her lap. She had known Colonel Morley in her own way, his brusque manners at the parish council, his curt nods at the grocer's, his curious habit of tipping his hat twice rather than once. To her, such details were threads in the larger tapestry of character. And what a tapestry the Colonel had been, full of pride, loneliness, and just the faintest shadow of fear beneath the bluster. When Inspector Cray entered the tea-room, brushing snow from his overcoat, conversation stopped as if a curtain had fallen. He nodded to Miss Marple before addressing the room. "Now then, no need for alarm. We've reason to believe Colonel Morley left the village sometime last night. There's no sign of foul play, at least not yet." A collective sigh of disappointment rippled through the villagers. They had wanted a scandal, and Cray was denying them one. Still, a few could not resist probing. "Left the village, you say?" asked Mr. Harcourt, the postmaster. "In this weather? Nonsense. The roads are near impassable." Cray shrugged. "Perhaps he set out on foot to meet someone nearby. We found his hat and glove by the lich gate. Until we find otherwise, we'll treat it as a disappearance, not a crime." Miss Marple's knitting paused for a single heartbeat. She looked up, meeting the inspector's eyes. "Forgive me, Inspector, but doesn't it strike you as odd that a man so precise as Colonel Morley should go walking without his coat?" Cray frowned. "It's possible he intended to return quickly." "Possible," she agreed, resuming her knitting. "Though I've always found that what people intend to do and what they actually do are rarely the same thing." When Cray left, taking the wind and curiosity with him, Miss Marple gathered her things and stepped out into the snow. She walked the familiar path toward the church, her boots crunching softly. The morning light gleamed faintly on the frozen hedgerows, and the silence held that peculiar weight that follows gossip and echo of words unkindly spoken. As she approached the churchyard, she saw the patch of trampled snow near the lyche gate where the hat and glove had been found. The constables had already removed them, but the marks remained, a scatter of prints leading in two directions, not one. One set small and neat, perhaps a woman's, the other broader, heavier. Both had been partially erased by fresh snowfall, yet Miss Marple could still read them as one reads a story half told. Inside the church, the altar cloth had been replaced, the floor scrubbed clean, and the candle finally extinguished. Still, the faint smell of beeswax and something darker iron perhaps lingered. She knelt briefly, her gloved fingers touching the wood where the blood had stained it. It was curious, she thought, how people try to erase unpleasantness as if it were a smudge to be polished away, when in truth it only hides what is most revealing. As she rose, footsteps echoed behind her. It was Dolly Larch, carrying a small basket of holly. "Oh, Jane, I can't think straight," she said breathlessly. "It's all so dreadful. The colonel missing, the police everywhere, and now Mrs. Weatherby insists he was murdered by gypsies. Honestly," Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear Dolly, people often prefer the dramatic explanation to the simple one, but sometimes the simple one hides beneath the drama, waiting to be noticed." Dolly sighed, then brightened. "Reverend Larch says we mustn't let fear spoil Christmas service tomorrow. He's determined the candle will be relit symbol of hope, he says." Miss Marple's eyes softened. Yes, hope, and perhaps illumination. When she left the church, the snow had stopped. The air felt oddly still, as if the village itself were holding its breath. Somewhere in the distance, a door slammed, and a dog began to bark, short and sharp. Miss Marple turned toward the sound and noticed a figure moving hurriedly near Rosebank House, half hidden by the hedges. She watched quietly until it disappeared behind the garden wall, then smiled to herself, a thought forming like a snowflake, fragile but definite. She had lived long enough to know that in Mildred's, every Christmas brought out not only the holly and hymns, but also the little sins people thought no one would ever notice. And this year, the candle had burned too long for a reason. Snow glazed the hedges into brittle lace as Miss Marple made her way toward Rosebank House, not directly, which would have looked purposeful, but with the meandering air of a lady inspecting gardens after a storm. The garden wall kept its secrets poorly. A drift pressed into the side gate showed the faintest scallop where it had recently swung inward, and beneath, a narrow trough of compressed snow suggested someone had pushed through, quickly and alone. Miss Marple stood a moment, considering the latch, which bore a smear of something dark and sticky. She removed a lace handkerchief and dabbed. The stain lifted brown, not red treacle, perhaps the sort one finds on a kitchen spoon after hurried pudding. Treacle on a garden latch on Christmas morning was curious, she thought, rather like finding a silk ribbon on a coal scuttle. Things that don't belong tend to tell tales. Mrs. Cora Peabody, the colonel's closest neighbor and never one to miss a window, appeared at her gate with a shawl about her shoulders. "You'll be wanting to know about the figure, Miss Marple," she called, confidential and triumphant. Came along just after the bell's hood pulled up, walked sharp as a governess late for prayers. I thought it was a boy, but it moved like a woman. Went round the back of Rosebank and then off toward the high path. "Green cloak," I said at once. "That's not village make." "Green," Miss Marple repeated mildly. "And no umbrella?" "Very stout-hearted." "Stout or rash?" Mrs. Peabody sniffed. "Mind. The colonel keeps a tidy household, if you don't count that charwoman who comes Mondays to do and mostly doesn't. I warned him, men living alone mislay things. Doors, too." "People mislay reasons quite as often as doors," Miss Marple said. and thanked her. Inspector Cray was at Rosebank, stamping snow from his boots in the hall. He had found the half-written letter, he told her tersely. And a second oddity besides. 2 cups on a tray in the study, one rinsed clean, the other stained with a ring of strong tea and the ghost of lemon. He had company last night, Cray said. No sign of a fire in the grate, though the ashpan's been emptied. Someone tidied. Miss Marple's glance fell upon the tray. No saucer for the rinsed cup, she murmured. That suggests haste or a guest unaccustomed to making themselves invisible. She looked toward the mantel. The Colonel's clock chimed a minute slow, and next to it lay a small tuft of grey ash, unlike the fine, soft residue of coal, more fibrous, like charred paper. She did not touch it, merely noted the faint beeswax sheen on the rim of the candle snuffer beside the clock. Wax here, and wax at the church. The mind, unaided, stitches even unmatching cloth. Colonel Morley quarrelled with Mr. Clemens 3 days ago, Cray went on, consulting his notebook. Witnessed by the postmaster. Land by the river. There's also a letter from a Mr. Frobisher, solicitor, regarding a codicil to the Colonel's will. Beneficiaries unnamed. Codicils have a way of reshuffling Christmas stockings, Miss Marple observed. And do you know who holds keys to the church, Inspector, besides Reverend and Mrs. Larch? Cray stared. Keys? The verger, Pargeter, the organist may have one too. What of it? Only that a candle which burns when it shouldn't may have been lit by someone who oughtn't. People who hold keys often believe they hold permission. She left him to his lists and turned uphill toward the high path, where Mrs. Peabody's green-cloaked figure had gone. The drift there was less disturbed, and Miss Marple saw what she had hoped to see. Small, neat impressions where the snow had crusted, the heel slightly worn on the inside edge, a woman's shoe. Practical but smart. The sort employed by school teachers and organists who stand long hours. Near a stile, the prints halted, turned back on themselves, then vanished into a muddle of broader tracks leading down toward the inn. It was very like a timid thought venturing forward, reconsidering, retreating into bolder company. At the church, she found Mr. Pargeter oiling the vestry lock, his face pink with wounded propriety. Nasty business, he huffed. Blood on the altar, I said to Reverend. Sir, that candle was down a full inch between even song and locking up. He said drafts. Drafts. My foot. An inch? Miss Marple's voice was gentle. You have a measuring eye. 30 years verger, he said with pride. Those beeswax pillars burn just under 2 inches an hour if the wick's well trimmed. That one did near 3. Ah, said Miss Marple softly, for clarity had a way of arriving dressed as arithmetic. A wick trimmed to hurry the flame. How helpful of someone to want the dark swallowed up faster than usual. She crossed to the chancel rail and looked at the polished wood. The new cloth lay smooth as a well-told lie, and yet something clung to the rail's underside, a thread of green wool, snagged where a sleeve might brush when one leaned too close. She teased it free with the corner of her handkerchief and tucked it away, then turned at the faint scrape of the south door. Alice Clemens, the village schoolmistress and sister to the quarrelsome landowner, stood in the doorway with her music folio pressed to her chest. Her cloak was green. Snow had melted in droplets along its hem. Her eyes, always quick, flickered from Miss Marple to the altar and back again, then steadied with determination learned from long classrooms. I've come to practice for tomorrow, she said too carefully. One mustn't let the children down. Indeed, one mustn't, Miss Marple agreed, as if discussing hymn numbers, and it is kind, in such weather, to keep a light burning for them. Alice's mouth opened, closed. She inclined her head and moved past, the faintest tremor in her glove when she set the folio on the organ bench. Miss Marple watched her hands, capable and precise, and thought of a wick trimmed to make time run fast, of 2 cups and charred paper, of a garden latch sticky with kitchen sweetness. In villages, She knew. Guilt rarely roared. It rustled. It tidied. It practiced scales. Miss Marple lingered a moment, longer by the organ, her gaze following the precise rhythm of Alice Clemens's fingers as they danced over the keys. The notes of Once in Royal David's City floated into the air, sweet and steady, but beneath them Miss Marple detected the tremor of something more than cold fingers. Alice's concentration was fierce, too fierce, perhaps, for such a simple carol. She played as though each note were a wall against intrusion. When at last the tune faded, Miss Marple stepped forward with her familiar, apologetic smile. "You do play beautifully, Miss Clemens. It must be a comfort to bring such order into the world. I've always thought music rather like life. It conceals discord so cleverly when played with confidence." Alice glanced up sharply, then laughed, a shade too quickly. "Music leaves no room for disorder, Miss Marple. It demands precision." "Indeed," said Miss Marple softly. "And one must be very sure of one's timing." "Mustn't one?" Alice looked puzzled, or pretended to be, and turned back to her music sheets. Miss Marple let the silence draw out before quietly leaving the church, her mind already assembling the fragments that had begun to form a faint outline. A green thread, 2 teacups, treacle on a latch, and a candle trimmed to burn too fast. Such odd little things, yet they spoke louder than confessions. As she crossed the churchyard, she met Reverend Larch trudging up the path, his breath misting. He looked harried, his usual serenity replaced by unease. "Miss Marple," he began, "I can't think what to make of all this. Poor Colonel Morley missing on Christmas Day. The inspector's just told me there's been a discovery near the river." Miss Marple stopped. "A discovery?" "Yes. One of the constables found a set of boot marks leading off the towpath and what appears to be a man's scarf caught on a bramble. They think it may be the Colonel's." Her voice dropped to a murmur. "And yet, no body?" Shook his head. "None. Cray believes he may have fallen into the river. But the snow fell thick that night. Surely we'd have seen more disturbance if that were true." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "Surely we would." The Reverend sighed and looked toward the church tower. "We shall pray for his safety at the morning service." "Do," she replied. "Prayer, if nothing else, keeps the heart from freezing." When she returned to her cottage on Old Mill Lane, she found young Tommy Redburn, the errand boy from the grocer's, waiting by her gate, his nose red from the cold. "Beg pardon, ma'am," he said, doffing his cap. "Inspector Cray said to give you this. Said you'd asked about it." He handed her a folded paper sealed with the police stamp. Inside, in Cray's untidy scrawl, were the words, "Cup residue tested. Lemon traces, not milk. Second cup brandied tea." Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly. Brandy was not the Colonel's habit. He was known for his discipline, for taking tea plain and meals precisely at 6. Someone else had introduced that indulgence. She thanked Tommy and gave him a 6pence, then sat by her window, watching the dimming sky. Somewhere in the lane, a carol began, a few hesitant children's voices, brave in the cold. She closed her eyes. The image of the altar candle returned, its long flame, the wax running in frantic rivulets, the faint blood stain below it. A light that had burned too long, too fast. Someone had wanted darkness delayed or guilt disguised. A knock startled her. Mrs. Larch stood at the door, bundled in her shawl. "Jane, I'm at my wit's end. I shouldn't say it, but Alice Clemens was in the vestry this morning before you arrived. I saw her through the window kneeling, as though to pray, but she seemed to be looking for something under the altar rail. When I came in, she jumped up and left in a hurry." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And did she take anything with her?" "I couldn't say, but she looked frightened." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. "Frightened people tidy things most thoroughly, I find." Mrs. Larch blinked. "Tidy? Why? Whatever do you mean?" Miss Marple smiled kindly. Oh, only that guilt, my dear, often resembles housekeeping. Both are most determined to make things appear spotless. When the vicar's wife had gone, Miss Marple opened her writing desk and took out the small green thread she had found beneath the chancel rail. It matched, almost perfectly, the shade of Alice Clemens's cloak. She set it beside a candle stub she had kept from the church, its wick shaved too fine, as if someone had deliberately hastened its end. Time, she whispered to herself, and concealment. One to burn, the other to cover. Outside, snow began to fall again, thick and silent, cloaking Mildred's in an uneasy calm. And as Miss Marple drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders, she felt the first tremor of certainty settle in her mind. The colonel had not vanished into the night. Someone had ensured that his absence appeared inevitable and had used Christmas itself as the perfect disguise. The next morning, when the villagers gathered for the service, Miss Marple would be there, quiet in her pew, her eyes watchful. She had no proof yet. Only threads green wool, lemon tea, and melted wax, but she knew that by tomorrow evening the wrong note in the Christmas hymn would finally sound clear. Morning came pale and brittle, the kind of light that showed every imperfection on the snow. The church bells rang out, steady but subdued, and the villagers drifted toward Mildred's wrapped in their Sunday coats, their breath clouding the cold air. It was Christmas Day. Yet conversation was muted, glances cautious. The empty pew where Colonel Morley usually sat upright and unsmiling seemed to cast its own chill. Miss Marple arrived a few minutes before the service, small and neat in her grey shawl. She noticed immediately that Alice Clemens was at the organ again, her green cloak folded carefully beside her seat. Her face was pale, but her posture rigid, composed spoke of someone determined to appear calm. Miss Marple took a pew near the back, from which she could see both the chancel and the congregation. The hymns began, soft and wavering. Yet Miss Marple was not listening to the words. She watched the people. Mr. Clemens, Alice's brother, entered late, stamping snow from his boots, his expression sour. He glanced at his sister only once, then fixed his eyes on the altar, where the fresh candle burned steadily in its holder. Miss Marple noticed how he frowned, as though calculating something. When the Reverend's sermon began, full of mercy and renewal, her attention wandered again to the candle. The new wick had been trimmed correctly, its flame modest and even. Still, Miss Marple's mind compared it with the one from 2 nights ago, how unnaturally tall it had burned, how desperate the light had seemed. A candle that burns too fast is a cry of urgency, not devotion. After the service, she lingered by the church gate, listening to the fragments of talk drifting through the cold. Someone said Inspector Cray had returned to Rosebank House that morning with fresh news. Someone else whispered of footprints, new ones found near the boathouse by the river. The police think the colonel might have gone there after all, muttered Mrs. Price, tugging her scarf tighter. The current's fierce this time of year. He could be halfway to the estuary by now. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Or perhaps not nearly so far. She walked toward the river path herself. Once the crowd thinned, her steps light but deliberate. The snow had hardened overnight, but new impressions lay atop the crust, fresh prints, small and narrow. A woman's again. She followed them until they curved toward the old boathouse, a wooden structure bowed with age. The door hung, slightly open. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and river weed. A lantern sat on the bench, its wick still warm to the touch. She bent to inspect the floorboards. There were marks there, scrapes where something heavy had been dragged, and beside them a single droplet of wax. Not beeswax yellow, but white. From a household candle, perhaps lit in haste. She straightened, eyes narrowing. Whoever had been here recently was tidying again. A noise startled her, a soft clatter outside. She turned to see Alice Clemens standing in the doorway, her face taut, her hands clutching her gloves. "Miss Marple! I didn't expect." "My dear, it's quite natural," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. The river draws us all when we're troubled. Water is so very forgiving. Alice swallowed hard. Inspector Cray told me they found the Colonel's walking stick near here. He asked if I'd ever borrowed it, as I sometimes visit his sister in Eastbourne. I said no, of course. Of course, Miss Marple echoed softly, studying her. You play the organ beautifully, Miss Clemens, though I imagine practicing must be rather lonely at night. Alice's composure wavered. Music helps one think. And sometimes, Miss Marple said kindly, it helps one forget. But forgetting, you know, never lasts. Truth is rather like a stubborn melody, it keeps returning, even when we change the key. Alice's lips parted, but before she could reply, voices echoed down the path. Inspector Cray appeared with 2 constables. He greeted Miss Marple with a curt nod, then turned to Alice. Miss Clemens, I'll need a word. We've found Colonel Morley's coat in the vicarage woodpile. Burn marks on the sleeve. Care to explain how it got there? Her eyes widened. The vicarage? But that's impossible. I haven't been near. Miss Marple's voice, calm as snowfall, interrupted. Oh, but you have, my dear. Yesterday morning, before the choir, the practice. Mrs. Larch saw you at the vestry door, remember? You were looking for something under the altar rail. Alice's face drained of color. I dropped a handkerchief. Ah, yes, Miss Marple said, her eyes kind but unrelenting. And perhaps a fragment of green wool, too. Cray looked sharply between them. Green wool? Miss Marple nodded. From her cloak. It caught, where the candle burned too fast. You see, Inspector, Miss Clemens lit that candle herself, not for prayer, but to disguise what had been spilt there before the service. She was trying to melt away what blood had marked the cloth. Unfortunately for her, wax preserves truth as often as it hides it. Alice's hands trembled, her gloves falling soundlessly onto the snow. The inspector's gaze hardened. You'd best come with us, Miss Clemens. But Miss Marple lifted a hand lightly. Not yet, Inspector. You see, our dear Miss Clemens may know how the candle came to burn, but I rather think she didn't spill the blood. The silence that followed was sharp as frost. Cray blinked. Then who did? Miss Marple's voice was almost tender. Someone who has been waiting for her to tidy up after him. Inspector Cray turned sharply toward Miss Marple, his boots crunching on the thin layer of ice just inside the boathouse. Waiting for her, he repeated, his tone half incredulous, half wary. Are you suggesting Miss Clemens was helping someone? Miss Marple's eyes lingered on Alice's trembling hands. Not helping, Inspector. Protecting. There's a difference, though it often leads to the same sort of trouble. Alice's breath caught. I wasn't protecting anyone, she burst out, but the words came too quickly, too loudly. The sound of them seemed to echo off the riverbank, too full of panic to convince even herself. Miss Marple's tone was calm, as though she were merely discussing parish gossip. You see, my dear, you may not realize it, but your brother has quite a temper, and pride, too, such a dangerous mixture. You were afraid what he might do if you didn't tidy things up. A sister's instinct can be terribly loyal. Cray's eyes narrowed. Her brother, Mr. Clemens? Yes, Miss Marple said, her voice almost gentle. He quarreled with Colonel Morley 3 days ago over that strip of land by the river, the same river we're standing beside now. I dare say he came here that night to finish what his temper began. Alice shook her head violently. No, he didn't mean he only wanted to talk to the Colonel again. To make peace, he said. And when tempers rise, Miss Marple murmured, talk can turn so easily to tragedy. You heard the quarrel, didn't you? You came to the church later, hoping to erase what he'd done before it was discovered. Tears welled in Alice's eyes. I thought if I could clean it away. If no one saw the blood, they'd think the Colonel had simply gone visiting. Cray's voice grew hard. Then you know where the Colonel is. She hesitated, and Miss Marple answered softly for her. Yes, Inspector. The colonel never left the village. He's here by the river." A terrible silence followed. The constables exchanged uneasy glances, and Cray's jaw tightened. "Search the boathouse," he ordered. The men moved quickly, pulling aside crates and tarpaulins. Beneath one, at the far end near the oar racks, the wood was darker, swollen with damp. One constable pried up a plank with a crowbar, and a chill, heavy air rose from below. Within moments, they had uncovered what Miss Marple already knew. They would find the faint outline of a man's form, wrapped in a coat that once had fine brass buttons. Colonel Morley's body lay concealed in the narrow space beneath the floor, the river seeping faintly through the cracks. Alice gave a strangled cry and turned away. Cray exhaled, low and grim. "So that's it, then." He was hidden here, likely waited to keep him from floating out with the tide. Miss Marple nodded, and by someone who knew the tide's habits very well. Her eyes moved toward the path that led back toward the mill. "Mr. Clemens worked along this river as a boy, didn't he? He'd know precisely how far the water would reach before dawn." Alice's voice broke. "He said it was an accident. The colonel struck him first, and he fell. He hit his head. My brother panicked. He begged me to help him, and I couldn't refuse. He's all the family I have." Cray's tone softened slightly, though his face stayed stern. "Where is he now?" "At home," she whispered. "He said he'd pack a bag. He was going to leave for London tonight." Miss Marple met Cray's eyes. "You'll find him still there, Inspector. Running away takes more courage than most murderers possess." The constables moved off at once, their boots pounding the frozen path. Alice sank onto a wooden bench, her face pale and wet with tears. Miss Marple, after a moment, sat beside her. "My dear," she said quietly, "I do not think your brother meant to kill him. But truth, when hidden, grows heavier with each hour. You did what seemed kind. Yet kindness built on fear is a poor foundation. It always gives way in the end." Alice sobbed softly, twisting her gloves in her lap. "I thought if the candle burned long enough, it would look holy. I wanted the blood to look like wax." Miss Marple reached over and took her hand. "It's a terrible thing, child. How easily good people confuse concealment with mercy. You lit that candle out of love, but it only drew more eyes to the place you hoped no one would look." Outside, the inspector's whistle pierced the cold air, sharp and final. Through the trees, two constables led a figure down the path, Mr. Clemens, his shoulders squared with futile defiance. Alice rose unsteadily, and Miss Marple guided her toward the door. "Come along, my dear. It's best to face things while the snow is still clean. It spares one the burden of pretending tomorrow." The river moved sluggishly beneath its veil of ice, the candle in the church still burning bright against the grey sky. Miss Marple paused, looking back only once, her expression unreadable. Christmas in Mildred's, she thought, would be quieter next year, quieter and perhaps wiser. The sun had begun to fade behind the line of frosted trees when Miss Marple finally returned to her cottage. The events of the day seemed to hang over the village like a heavy shawl, soft but suffocating. The news of Colonel Morley's body had spread before evening tea. And though most villagers claimed shock, few looked genuinely surprised. Death, Miss Marple reflected, always came to villages with less drama than one expected. People simply folded it into their routines, the way they did with weather. She set her kettle on the hob and waited for it to sing. Through her small kitchen window, she could see the faint flicker of lamplight in the Clemens cottage across the lane. The inspector had taken Mr. Clemens away not long after the discovery, but the sight of that house still lit, still neat, gave her an odd feeling. Something remained unresolved. The puzzle pieces fit too cleanly, too easily. It was, she thought, like a jigsaw with one section perfectly finished and another that refused to match the pattern. When the knock came at her door, she was not surprised. It was Inspector Cray, his coat dusted with snow, his expression weary but satisfied. "All tied up, Miss Marple," he said as she ushered him in. Mr. Clemens confessed outright. Said the colonel struck him. He struck back. The man fell, hit the edge of the boat, cracked his skull. Panic after that. His sister helped move the body and clean the scene. Tragic business, but straightforward. Miss Marple poured the tea, her manner as mild as ever. And yet you don't sound entirely convinced, Inspector. He frowned. Don't I? Well, there are things that don't quite sit right. For instance, the colonel's head wound doesn't match the edge of that boat. It's rounder, more like a blow from a blunt instrument. And then there's this. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket, a page torn from a letter. Found it in the colonel's desk drawer. The rest was burned. But this piece survived. She took it delicately, scanning the few lines that remained. Cannot agree to the new arrangement. I will not be coerced. The truth will out. Even if it ruins the name. The signature had been lost to fire. Coerced. Miss Marple repeated softly. That's a strong word for a quarrel about land. Exactly, Cray said. Frobisher, the solicitor, confirmed there was a codicil to the will, but he hadn't yet filed it. Morley had changed a beneficiary. That's all he'd tell me. Said the papers were still with the colonel, but they weren't in the house. Nor in the safe. Miss Marple set her teacup down with a faint clink. Then perhaps, she said, someone else had reason to visit the colonel that night, someone who wanted those papers destroyed. Cray blinked. You mean apart from the Clemenses? Quite apart. The colonel was not well liked, I think. He had a knack for knowing things about people they would rather he forgot. That is a dangerous habit in a small parish. He rubbed his chin. You think someone else came to Rosebank House before or after the quarrel? Oh, I imagine so, Miss Marple murmured. The fire in the colonel's grate had been cleaned far too thoroughly for panic. And the ash, if you recall, was of fine paper, legal paper, I would guess. Then the Clemens pair may have stumbled on the aftermath rather than caused it. Precisely, said Miss Marple, though I fear they are too tangled in their good intentions to disentangle themselves easily. She rose and went to the window again. Snow had begun to fall, slow and heavy, muting the world into silence. Across the lane, the light in the Clemenses' house flickered once and went out. Tell me, Inspector, she said. Who first reported the colonel missing? He looked surprised. Why? Mrs. Cora Peabody, his neighbor, said she saw his front curtains drawn when they're usually open. Why? Miss Marple turned from the window, her face thoughtful. Because Mrs. Peabody also claimed to have seen a green cloak passing toward Rosebank that night. An odd detail to recall so confidently in a snowstorm, don't you think? Almost as if she needed a story ready. Cray frowned deeply. You believe she's involved? I believe, Miss Marple said gently, that she knows more than she ought, and that she might have had reason to wish Colonel Morley silent before he ruined her. What reason? Why don't we call on her and see? She said with a small smile. After all, the truth rarely stays buried long in snow. It has a way of thawing. Cray gave a grim nod, pulling on his gloves again. You've the devil's instinct, Miss Marple. Not instinct, Inspector, she replied, taking her shawl from its hook. Just memory. I once knew a woman who burned a document to save her reputation, and in doing so, signed her own ruin. People do much the same thing over and over, you know. Human nature changes far slower than seasons. As they stepped out into the evening, the cold bit sharp and clean, and the bells of Mildred's began to chime faintly through the snow. Somewhere, behind the curtained windows of Mrs. Peabody's house, a shadow moved a figure extinguishing a lamp in a hurry. Miss Marple saw it and smiled to herself. The puzzle was not finished after all. The walk to Mrs. Peabody's cottage was short but steep, and the snow, now thick and soundless, gave the path an eerie stillness. Miss Marple walked beside Inspector Cray, her small figure steady and deliberate despite the cold. You'll find her quite the conversationalist, she said mildly. But one must listen not to what Mrs. Peabody says, but to what she hurries past. That's where truth likes to hide. The inspector grunted, his breath steaming. I'll take your word for it, Miss Marple. She's been at the heart of gossip since I set foot in this village. Knows everyone's business, she claims. Oh, she does, Miss Marple replied, and she's clever enough to make certain no one quite knows hers. They reached the gate. The little house, tucked beneath a yew hedge, had its curtains drawn tight and a faint golden glow from the sitting room. Cray knocked firmly, and after a pause came the sound of shuffling steps and the turning of a key. The door opened a cautious crack. Inspector. Miss Marple. Mrs. Peabody's voice trembled between surprise and irritation. At this hour? Whatever has happened now? Cray tipped his hat. We won't keep you long, ma'am. There are just a few points about Colonel Morley's death that need clarifying. Her eyes darted between them. Then she stood aside reluctantly. Well, come in then, though I don't see what more there is to say. Dreadful business. I told my cousin only this morning, mark my words, it'll end in scandal. The warmth of the room was oppressive after the cold outside. Coal burned low in the grate, and the air carried a faint, sticky scent of polish and oranges. Miss Marple sat neatly on the edge of an armchair, her gloved hands folded. Cray remained standing. You were the first to notice the colonel missing, Mrs. Peabody, he began. You said you saw his curtains drawn that morning. Yes, indeed. Quite out of character. The colonel was always up early, especially on Christmas Eve. I looked out at 7 and saw them still closed, and I said to myself, that's not right. And later, Cray prompted, you mentioned seeing someone in a green cloak passing toward his house that same evening. Mrs. Peabody hesitated, her fingers worrying at a handkerchief. I did, yes. A small figure, hurrying. The Clemens girl, I thought. Miss Marple's eyes were kind but penetrating. Such admirable eyesight, my dear, especially through a snowstorm. Tell me, were you looking from your kitchen window or your front room? Why, my kitchen, of course. Faces the lane. How fortunate, Miss Marple said softly. Because the lane bends sharply near your wall, doesn't it? One can scarcely see the colonel's gate from there unless one steps out into the yard. Mrs. Peabody flushed. Well, perhaps I did step out. You don't imagine I spied on the poor girl? Oh, I wouldn't dream of it, Miss Marple said pleasantly. But I do imagine you saw more than you've told the inspector. You see, I think you weren't looking for Miss Clemens at all. You were watching to see whether the colonel would go out. Cray's gaze sharpened. Is that true, Mrs. Peabody? She drew herself up. Affronted. I was merely concerned. The colonel and I had, well, a disagreement earlier in the week. Over my boundary hedge. He could be most unpleasant when crossed. Miss Marple's voice dropped to a gentle murmur. I imagine he could be worse than unpleasant when he held proof of one's wrongdoing. You see, my dear, I recall that small donation to the church fund one given anonymously but in very round numbers. And then there's the matter of the post office parcels. Someone has been receiving letters from London under a false name, letters containing more than words. Mrs. Peabody went still, the blood draining from her face. I don't know what you're implying, Miss Marple. Oh, it isn't an implication, Miss Marple said kindly. Merely an observation. The colonel was a methodical man. He noted things. I believe he discovered your little investment scheme, taking contributions from villagers for a property venture that never quite existed. He meant to expose you after Christmas. That codicil he had drawn up, why, I imagine it removed your name from his bequest entirely. The silence that followed was as sharp as the crackle of the fire. Then Mrs. Peabody whispered, he threatened to ruin me. I only meant to frighten him, make him see sense. He laughed at me. Cray stepped forward. So you went to his house? She clutched her handkerchief to her mouth, trembling. Yes, he'd been drinking. He called me a liar. Said he'd hand my letters to the police. I grabbed the first thing I could, a candlestick. He fell, and there was so much blood, I didn't know what to do. Miss Marple's eyes softened with something that was not quite pity. And then, when you saw Miss Clemens arrive, you thought Providence had given you an escape. You slipped out the back way, knowing her visit would explain the noise, the lights. You went home and waited. You let her clean what you had done, believing the blame would fall naturally upon her brother. Mrs. Peabody's shoulders sagged, and she began to weep soundlessly. Cray's jaw tightened. You realize this is a confession, ma'am. You'll need to come with me. As he spoke, Miss Marple rose quietly, her expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. Inspector, she said softly, you might allow her to fetch a shawl first. She'll need it for the walk. And perhaps a moment to pray. He looked at her curiously but nodded. A minute. No more. When Mrs. Peabody left the room, Miss Marple moved to the mantelpiece. Her eyes rested on a brass candlestick, twin to the one that had struck Colonel Morley. She traced a finger near its base and saw, faint but visible, a smudge of reddish-brown. It was here all along, she murmured. In plain sight, guilt rarely hides far, it only hides neatly. Cray turned. You knew. I suspected, she said. A woman who polishes everything but one thing well. That's always the thing worth looking at. Moments later, Mrs. Peabody returned. Shawl clasped tight, her eyes hollow. She looked at Miss Marple, almost pleading. I didn't mean to kill him. I only wanted to save myself. Miss Marple's voice was quiet and unyielding. Yes, my dear. And that is what every sin begins as self-preservation. Cray escorted her out into the snow, where the constables waited. The air was still and heavy, muffling every sound but the crunch of their boots. Miss Marple stood at the doorway, watching until the figures disappeared into the white haze. When the silence settled again, she looked up toward the church steeple, rising dark against the winter sky. The candle that had burned too long, the wax that had hidden blood, the threads of deceit that had bound one villager to another, each had done its work. And now, as the truth stood bare and cold as the snow itself, she felt the faintest ache of sadness. It was always the same. Behind every crime, every desperate act, there was fear small, human fear, dressed in pride and secrecy. She turned back toward her quiet cottage, where the kettle still waited on the hob, and thought how fitting it was that on Christmas night the village would finally rest not in peace, perhaps, but in honesty, and in Miss Marple's heart that was peace enough. Even with Mrs. Peabody in custody, the village did not exhale. Windows glowed and curtains twitched. Tea was poured and went cold. Miss Marple, walking home alone beneath the muffled hush of falling snow, felt no triumph. Only the prickling awareness that a story tidied too swiftly often hid an untidier truth. She had seen it before, a nervous confession fitting the outline of events like a glove, yet leaving the shape of a second hand still unaccounted for. Inspector Cray joined her at the corner by the yew hedge, his stride shortening to match hers. It fits, he said, as if saying it might finally make it so. Head wound, motive, candlestick. She admitted to striking him. The rest, well, panic and concealment. Miss Marple nodded, courteous, and said nothing until they reached the churchyard. A strong woman, Mrs. Peabody. Strong enough to lift a candlestick, but to move a man of the colonel's build from his house through the snow, down to the boathouse, and slide him under the floor. In one journey, and without being seen. She tilted her head. It is possible, but I do not think she traffics in possibilities when fear is at her heels. She traffics in help. Cray stopped, the steam of his breath briefly veiling his face. Help? From whom? The person who could open doors for her, Miss Marple said gently. Doors of places people do not expect to be opened at unholy hours. He stared at the dark bulk of Mildred's. You mean the church? The altar cloth was changed promptly. Miss Marple went on, soft as falling flakes. The floor scrubbed, the candle wick trimmed to devour time. All these are a verger's talents, not a neighbor's improvisations. Mr. Pargeter measures wax by the hour. He told us so with pride. Cray gave a low whistle. Pargeter swore he locked up, that he noticed nothing until morning. And Alice Clemens, she was there before dawn, tampering with the cloth. Oh yes, Miss Marple agreed. Miss Clemens lit the first deceit out of love and confusion. But the candle burned for 2 days too long. That persistence smells not of panic but of habit. When something needs to look holy, Mr. Pargeter is the man who knows how to make it so. They parted there, Cray to the station, and paperwork. Miss Marple to her quiet cottage. She lit a small lamp, set the kettle on, and laid out her little hoard of facts as neatly as darning wool. The treacle smear at Rosebank's side gate. Sticky and domestic. The 2 cups on the Colonel's tray, one rinsed, one lemon-stained. The grey tuft of ash on the mantel, fibrous as legal paper. The green thread from the chancel rail, the verger's pride in combustion rates. And over all of it, the candle's excessive zeal, converting hours into minutes as if urged on by an anxious hand. She remembered Mr. Pargeter's face. When he spoke of the inch lost between services, aggrieved, expert, proprietorial. Pride, she had learned, leaves fingerprints, and fear leaves smudges where polish will not quite reach. The knock came softly. Dolly Larch stood on the threshold, cheeks wind-bright above her shawl. Jane, forgive me just a moment. It's Mr. Pargeter. He's in the vestry now, fidgeting about with the candles. Says we must keep one burning till midnight for the departed, he told Reverend. Poor man, Leonard Morley, but it struck me. It wasn't Mr. Pargeter's way to decide such things without asking. No, Miss Marple said, taking up her cloak. It is not his way at all. It is his want. They crossed the snow together, the church looming soft-edged, the stained glass black as slate. In the vestry, lamplight made a snug circle. Pargeter stood at the work-table, trimming wicks with a penknife, his movements brisk and tidy. A rolled cloth lay nearby, faintly dark at one corner, the kind that wipes away what should not be seen. My dear Mr. Pargeter, Miss Marple said, all gentle approval, so faithful. Even at this hour, he looked up, colouring with pleasure. Mrs. Marple, Mrs. Larch, the church must look her best. There's been unseemliness enough. Quite, Miss Marple agreed. And you are so very clever with time, making candles do in 1 hour what they should take 2 to accomplish. I always admire a craftsman who knows his materials. Something tightened behind his eyes. I do not, I mean the draughts, ma'am. They make a pillar burn hungrily, Miss Marple finished kindly. Yes, and hungriness is contagious, I find. One greedy flame inspires another. She touched the rolled cloth with a fingertip. You were here the night after the blood was spilled. You changed the cloth again after Alice Clemens had already meddled, and you relit the altar candle so it would swallow time before anyone could mark where it had fallen. You did it for pity, I imagine, or for coin. His mouth opened, shut. He glanced at Dolly Larch, then away. Inspector Cray has his culprit, he said stiffly. Mrs. Peabody struck the blow. Everyone knows. Yes, Miss Marple said, with a softness that carried no mercy. But everyone does not yet know who fetched the key to open a sacred door, who wiped the rail a second time when wax would not wholly pass for grace, who helped lift a dead man because a frightened woman could not. You, who count inches of beeswax, counted the minutes till morning as if God kept ledgers in your columns. He made a harsh, small sound. I never touched the body. No, Miss Marple allowed. I think you fetched the lantern and told Mrs. Peabody where the floor pries up in the boathouse, and because you dislike fuss, you tidied after her. She pays her pew rent punctually, does she not? And from time to time, A generous envelope in the vestry for heating coal, perhaps. Color rose again, blotchy now. The church must be kept, Mrs. Marple. People will not give if the place looks shabby. They'll spend on oranges and puddings before charity. People always do, Miss Marple said, almost sadly. And those who serve sanctuaries are not immune to needing warm fires and quiet compliments. But good deeds bought with dirty coins burn the fingers sooner or later. I think Mrs. Peabody had such coins. I think you found your conscience too late and employed your skill instead. He pressed both palms to the table, the knife bright between them. You cannot prove. Proof, Miss Marple murmured, is such a hopeful word. Dolly, would you be so kind as to fetch Inspector Cray? Tell him, Mr. Pargeter keeps a penknife whose blade shows beeswax along the back, not the edge where a man trims wick rather than rope, and ask him to look in the bottom drawer there. I fancy he'll find a wad of legal paper ends used to start last night's fire raggy fiber, not the wood pulp kind. Mr. Pargeter lights quickly. That is his gift. Dolly hesitated only a heartbeat, then slipped away, her footsteps ghosting over stone. Pargeter stared at Miss Marple, breathing too fast. I did not kill him, he said, the words tumbling now. But the church, if scandal broke, collections vanish, repairs put off, the roof leaks again. Mrs. Peabody begged me, said it would be a mercy to spare the parish outrage at Christmas-tide. She had money for the coal fund. I thought I could manage the rest. Manage, Miss Marple repeated, her gaze very steady. A comforting word for sin that prefers clean hands. You should have left mercy to God and muddle to the police. You made holy work the servant of fear. Bootsteps sounded in the nave, firm and many. Pargeter's shoulders slumped. He let the knife fall. It clicked on wood as the vestry door opened and Inspector Cray filled the frame with cold air and purpose. Miss Marple stepped back to let the law in. There was no relish in her face, only the gentle fatigue of a woman who had watched too many Christmases try to redeem the same old human mischief and fail until Easter. As Cray took the verger's arm, she reached out and turned down the lampwick a fraction. The flame steadied, modest again, no longer urged to haste by anxious fingers. In the nave, the altar stood plain and honest in the half-dark, its new cloth simple as a well-kept truth. Somewhere outside, snow loosened from a bough and fell in a soft sigh. The village would sleep at last, but not yet deeply. There and remained explanations to give, small shames to bear, and one final knot to untie before peace could take root without the help of any candle at all. The following morning dawned cold and colorless, a muted grey light filtering over Mildred's as if even the sun disapproved of what it had witnessed. The village, though hushed, was restless. Doors opened early, neighbors whispered at their gates, and the news spread with the inevitability of frost creeping over glass. The verger, Mr. Pargeter, had been taken away before dawn. His arrest so soon after Mrs. Peabody's left, everyone uncertain whether to be relieved or ashamed. Miss Marple sat by her small fire, her knitting motionless in her lap, thinking not of scandal or guilt, but of the strange comfort that people found in tidy explanations. The trouble with tidy explanations, she mused, was that they so often left one last corner of the rug turned up. Her door creaked open without ceremony. Dolly Larch entered, cheeks flushed from the cold, hands full of morning gossip. Jane, it's too dreadful. They say Mr. Pargeter confessed everything, helping hide the body, burning the papers, even lighting that wretched candle. Reverend's beside himself. He says the church must be reconsecrated after Christmas. She sank into the nearest chair, voice trembling between indignation and pity. And to think, I lent that man my husband's muffler only last week. Miss Marple smiled faintly, pouring her a cup of tea. It's always unpleasant to see the familiar turn deceitful, but I shouldn't think the Reverend need worry about reconsecration. The sins of the servants rarely stain the altar as deeply as the intentions behind them. Dolly blinked. You mean Mrs. Peabody? I mean, Miss Marple said gently, that one ought not assume the matter is concluded merely because two frightened people have spoken under pressure. Dolly looked confused, but before she could question further, a knock sounded again, firmer this time. Inspector Cray stood on the threshold, hat in hand, his expression a mixture of fatigue and reluctant respect. "Morning, Miss Marple. May I?" "Of course, Inspector," she said, gesturing toward the fire. "Tea's still hot." He accepted, setting his hat on the table. "You were right again, it seems." Pargeter admitted to everything. Said he helped Mrs. Peabody for the sake of the church fund. Claimed the money was meant for heating coal. "It's always coal or charity, isn't it?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Human nature prefers its excuses practical." Cray sipped his tea. "Still, something bothers me. His story about the codicil, he swore he burned the papers himself. But we've found no trace of the will or the envelope Frobisher described. He might be lying to protect someone, or simply to make himself look important. Either way, the document's gone." Miss Marple nodded, gazing into the fire. "And without it, Colonel Morley's estate reverts to the previous terms." "Exactly. His cousin in Bath inherits. A Mr. Gerald Morley never set foot in Mildred's, according to anyone here." "Curious," Miss Marple murmured, "especially as the Colonel was not fond of his cousin. He once described him as an idle man with greedy hands." Cray frowned. "You heard that yourself?" "Not directly," she said, "but gossip has a way of being precise when money is involved." He leaned back, thoughtful. "You think someone else might have wanted that codicil destroyed, someone who stood to gain if it disappeared?" "I think," said Miss Marple quietly, "that greed wears many disguises. Sometimes it looks like charity, sometimes like duty. And sometimes, Inspector, it looks like friendship." Before he could reply, a sharp knock at the door interrupted them. It was young Tommy Redburn again, snow dusting his shoulders. "Letter for you, ma'am," came by the early post. "From Bath, it says." Miss Marple took the envelope, her expression unreadable as she studied the handwriting firm. Slanted, unmistakably masculine. She opened it slowly, scanning the neat lines. "How interesting," she murmured. "It seems Mr. Gerald Morley was already aware of his inheritance 2 days before the Colonel died." Cray straightened. 2 days before. She handed him the letter. Note the date, and his mention of gratitude for the Colonel's change of heart. Mr. Frobisher must have written to inform him of the intended alteration, but only one person could have known that letter had been sent and could have intercepted it before the solicitor realized the Colonel was dead. The inspector's eyes darkened. "You mean Frobisher himself?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, Inspector. Solicitors are dull, not dishonest. But the postal clerk in Mildred's Mr. Harcourt is both punctual and inquisitive. He sorts every letter personally. A man in his position might learn a great deal without ever opening an envelope." Cray stared. "Harcourt? He's been in the village for 20 years. "Precisely why no one suspects him," she said mildly. "And yet he was the first to tell you of the quarrel between the Colonel and Mr. Clemens. Too ready, too specific. Gossip often begins with truth, but Mr. Harcourt repeats only what suits him. I imagine he delayed certain letters, perhaps misplaced others, and learned long ago that controlling the post is rather like controlling the flow of secrets." Cray was already standing. "I'll have him questioned." Miss Marple smiled. "Do. And when you do, ask about the parcel addressed to Mrs. Peabody that never arrived. The one she complained of at the grocer's, my investment documents, she called them. If I'm right, that parcel contained the missing codicil. Mr. Harcourt intercepted it, saw its value, and sold its silence. Mrs. Peabody's schemes made her desperate. His greed made him bold. Between them, they set a whole tragedy in motion. Cray stared at her in admiration and fatigue. "You never miss a thread, do you, Miss Marple?" "I do," she said softly. "But human nature rarely changes its pattern. I merely follow the weave." By evening, word spread once more through the snow-dusted streets. Mr. Harcourt had been taken for questioning. When faced with the letter to Gerald Morley and the recovered codicil, found hidden in his own postbag, he broke quickly. The Colonel's death had been an accident of opportunity, a quarrel begun by Mrs. Peabody, ended by her panic, and covered by those who each sought their own advantage. Pargeter, Harcourt, even poor Alice Clemens, they had all added their strokes to the same crooked canvas. When Inspector Cray brought the news to Miss Marple, she received it with quiet composure. "It is as I thought," she said. "A crime of community, not of cruelty. Everyone took a little piece of the truth and hid it, thinking it small enough to keep. And yet together," Cray said softly, "they killed a man." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, her eyes distant, "not by malice, but by cowardice. In villages, murder seldom needs a murderer, only a handful of frightened souls who prefer silence to shame." Cray rose to leave, the candlelight throwing long shadows across her neat parlor. "You'll forgive me if I don't come near Mildred's for a while," he said wearily. "It's too full of saints and sinners for my taste." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear Inspector, they are very often the same people." When he was gone, she sat a while longer, listening to the faint toll of the church bell across the frozen fields. The flame of her lamp wavered gently in the draught, then steadied, modest, patient, no longer burning too fast. Outside, the snow began again, covering the footprints that led away from her door, smoothing every path until the village looked innocent once more. Snow continued to fall gently that night, laying a clean, deceptive calm across the village. The events of the last few days had left Mildred's raw and uneasy like a household after a quarrel, when the silence is louder than words. Yet by morning, the routine of life had begun to stitch itself together again. The baker's boy called his rounds. The church bell tolled for morning prayers. And at the vicarage, Mrs. Larch arranged her flowers with a tremulous determination that things must appear normal. Miss Marple, as ever, rose early. The world outside her window looked almost innocent, wrapped in snow, but she knew innocence was rarely more than a matter of appearance. She dressed warmly, took her umbrella, and walked down the lane toward the church. Inside, the scent of beeswax and old wood lingered. The altar stood simple and clean now, its cloth newly pressed, its candle burning at a modest pace. No more desperate flames, no more secrets. She knelt for a moment, not in piety exactly, but in quiet reflection, then heard soft steps behind her. It was Reverend Larch, his face pale with fatigue. "Miss Marple," he said gently, "I don't know what to say. It's hard to understand how so many could have played a part in such darkness. These were good people, faithful, generous." She looked up at him kindly. "Yes, my dear Reverend, good people, but frightened ones. Fear, you see, is rather like a draught. It creeps in through the smallest cracks, and once it's inside, even decent souls shiver into folly. Mrs. Peabody feared disgrace. Mr. Pargeter feared ruin. Mr. Harcourt feared poverty. Each told themselves a little lie for comfort, and little lies, when combined, can build a dreadful truth." He sighed, gripping the pew rail. "I keep thinking of that candle. You said it burned for 2 days too long. Perhaps it's fitting it gave light, even while it concealed sin. Light always does," she said, softly. "That's its nature, to show what we'd rather not see. Even the best of us forget that sometimes." The Reverend hesitated, then smiled faintly. "You have a remarkable gift for understanding people, Miss Marple. I only wish it didn't have to come through tragedy." "Oh, my dear, that's quite the price of observation," she said, rising. "One sees a good deal more than one would wish to, but it's only by looking squarely that one can forgive properly, don't you think?" He nodded, and she left him there, alone with his prayers and his candles. Outside, the village seemed to breathe again. A few children threw snowballs near the green. The air held the faint scent of pine and smoke. Yet Miss Marple noticed the way people avoided one another's eyes. The postmaster's window shuttered early. Mrs. Peabody's cottage closed and silent, the verger's home already emptied of belongings. Every street carried the echo of what had been uncovered. Mildred's would never gossip so freely again. By afternoon, Miss Marple had returned to her cottage. She made tea, set her knitting basket aside, and sat by the fire, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. Outside, a robin perched on the sill, watching her as though expecting a crumb. She smiled faintly and murmured, "You've a better instinct for truth than most, little one. You simply wait and listen." Her clock chimed softly 5 o'clock, the same hour when, only days ago, Dolly Larch had discovered that candle still burning. So much had changed since then, yet so little. There would always be candles burning too long somewhere, always human hands ready to trim a wick or hide a stain. It was, she thought, the quiet constancy of human nature that both caused and cured all ills. When darkness deepened and the snow stopped falling, she stirred the fire once more, then reached for her knitting. The wool was white this time, pure, simple, and steady. As her needles clicked in the hush, she reflected that Christmas in Mildred's would be remembered not for its tragedy, but for its lesson. That the smallest deceit, like the smallest flame, could grow beyond control if left untended. She paused, gazing at the quiet glow of the lamp beside her. Its flame burned modestly, properly trimmed, patient in its duty. A proper light, she thought, the kind that neither blinds nor hides, but simply endures. And somewhere in the distance, the church bell tolled again, low and slow, as if the village itself were whispering a promise. That from this Christmas onward, they would keep their lights steady, their hearts honest, and their secrets few. The days that followed were quieter, as though the village had exhaled at last. The snow, which had fallen so heavily during the week of the murder, began to thaw. Icicles slipped from the eaves, and muddy slush edged the lanes where children now played again. Yet beneath the surface calm, something had shifted in Mildred's an invisible awareness, like a bruise beneath pale skin. Every villager carried a trace of it, though few would ever speak of it aloud. Miss Marple moved through her routines as she always did, unhurried, unremarkable. At the grocer's, she discussed the weather and the rise in the price of tea. At church, she admired the flowers and murmured approval of Reverend Larch's sermon on repentance. But those who knew her well noticed the small, knowing stillness in her eyes, a sign that she had not quite put the matter to rest. For all her gentleness, she possessed a mind that did not easily stop thinking, not even when the world said the case was closed. It was late one afternoon when Dolly Larch came calling again, bringing with her the sort of anxious goodwill that follows tragedy. She brought a plate of scones and her usual flurry of talk. "Reverend says we must all try to forgive," she said earnestly, warming her hands by the fire. "I suppose he's right, but I can't help feeling dreadful for poor Mrs. Peabody, and for that Harcourt man. To think they both sat beside me at the harvest supper." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Forgiveness," she said, "is often more a matter of understanding than forgetting. People rarely mean to do great harm. They only fail to notice the harm that grows from small neglects." Dolly sighed, shaking her head. "You make it sound so simple." "It is," said Miss Marple gently, "though not at all easy." When Dolly had gone, leaving behind the faint scent of lavender and gossip, Miss Marple tidied the tea things and walked to her window. Dusk had fallen early. The last of the snow gleamed faintly along the hedgerows. Across the village green, the lamplighter was making his rounds, coaxing small golden flames to life one by one. Each lamplight reflected briefly on the wet cobbles, like drops of truth too bright to be ignored. She thought again of the Colonel, so proud, so certain, and yet undone by the very vices he despised in others. She thought of Mrs. Peabody's trembling hands, of Pargeter's shame, of Harcourt's quiet greed. Each had acted from fear, and fear, she reflected, was the most efficient accomplice of evil. It required no courage, only imagination, and there was far too much imagination in Mildred's. A small movement drew her eye. The robin again, perched on her gatepost. Feathers puffed against the cold. She opened the door and scattered a few crumbs upon the path. The bird hopped nearer, head tilted, quick and unafraid. "There now," she murmured. "You see, we're all creatures of habit, returning where we've found kindness before." Behind her, the fire crackled, throwing soft reflections across the polished surface of her table. On it lay her knitting white wool, half a scarf, now. She resumed her seat, the needles clicking gently as her thoughts drifted back over the case. No grand villains, no dramatic motives, just ordinary lives entangled by deceit, each thread pulled by human frailty until the whole fabric came apart. It was, she decided, the way of things. Evil seldom entered with a shout. It crept in softly, disguised as necessity or pride, and made its home among good intentions. And yet, she thought, so did grace. For every candle that burned too long, there was another burning quietly in some unseen corner, lighting the way back. When the clock struck 9, she set her knitting aside and reached to trim the wick of her lamp. The flame steadied under her careful touch, glowing warm and even. Outside, the church bell tolled, once a low, familiar sound carrying through the night air. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes soft in the lamplight. The village would gossip again, quarrel again, sin again. But it would also forgive. That, she thought, was what made life bearable. She closed her curtains, drew her shawl around her shoulders, and settled by the fire. The candle on her mantel burned modestly, no longer too long, no longer too bright, just enough to hold back the dark.